Welcome to Byju's. We hope you are ready to join us for another exciting, fascinating review of international affairs of the past week. After the excitement of the presidential elections in the United States, to some it may appear that the week was lacking a bit in excitement, but let's assure you that there have been momentous events taking place almost all over the world in different continents that impinge on our national interest and that are likely to have a great interest for you, all those of you who are preparing for competitive examinations. The event on which all eyes were focused in India was a 15 East Asian Summit, to be more precise, where all the ASEAN members and some other countries were participating, and people were wondering how India would conduct its diplomacy there, what kind of a response to the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea would be there, and so on. But an event which overshadowed all this was the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP program, which is the foundation or establishment of the largest trading bloc in the world. It represents 2.2 billion people. It represents 1/3 of the GDP of the world. It represents 30% of the international trade. After the decline of the European Union in recent past, it appears to be the largest trading bloc which the world has seen. And it assumes a great significance because the countries who signed this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership program included China, all the 10 ASEAN countries which are its trading partners, but surprisingly it also had Japan and South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. Now, if you recall, we have been reviewing this in the past weeks. Australia has been having a state of almost a trade war with China. The Chinese have imposed strong tariffs against import from Australia on barley, on wine, on pork and beef. And of course, the Australians incurred the wrath of the Chinese by saying that they suspected that the Chinese had suppressed the information about the outbreak of the COVID virus. And then the Chinese retaliated by saying that the Australians behave like racists, behave like white supremacists, and they want to dominate this area. Now, all this battle was going on, and the Australians reciprocated by imposing restrictions on Chinese trade and also said that they would restrict the number of Chinese students in Australia, the Chinese think tank in Australia, people of Chinese origin who had become Australian citizens were all targeted and profiled. This is one part. But suddenly what goes wrong that the Australians decide to sign this agreement? Now there are two things. The historical background has to be understood properly. For past 8 years, these negotiations were on. There was a small time when India was also participating very enthusiastically in this. And before the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership program came, President Donald Trump and the United States were also talking of a trans-Indo-Pacific free trade area, which would have been even larger, and into which United States would have been a party. Now, obviously, there was no question of United States joining this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Program free trade area because America and China are arrayed on opposite side of the battlefront, so to speak. The Americans have been conducting a trade war with China, but the issues are more interesting. The Japanese, who have wanted India to countervail China, had proposed the Quad, to which India has enthusiastically responded. The Malabar exercises have taken place. Japan still wants India to join this forum and has said that India can reconsider its decision to stay away from the forum, come back to it and benefit in this free trade area. India obviously decided to stay away from this forum because this is going to be dominated by China. But is that good enough reason for India to exclude this forum from its calculations? Because if you do not join this forum, there is a very interesting phrase in English which they say, if you don't want to become the part of the menu, you at least sit on the table. So you can decide what is happening, you can have a voice in what you are doing, and you can play a role in pushing back if you resist something. Now, interestingly, there are some other questions. India obviously cannot join it at the moment for different reasons, because the Chinese have confronted India militarily, giving rise to an explosive conflict in the Himalayan borderland, and India has consistently refused to be a party to the One Belt One Road program because the Chinese are trying to dominate not only economically but strategically the continent of Asia. So And part of the Chinese connecting roads of the historic Silk Route pass through territory which has been illegally occupied by Pakistan and handed over to China. So India has serious enough reasons to object to One Belt, One Road, and similarly be apprehensive about what is happening in the Comprehensive Economic Partnership program here in this forum. Now, people have asked some other questions which are important. Why was this necessary? Already ASEAN countries were the largest trading partner of China. For them, China was the largest trading partner. For China also, these 10 countries, these emerging countries in ASEAN region were very, very important. Now, the Chinese have a twofold mechanism. They already were enjoying a happy enough trade relationship with the ASEAN countries. And it is not as if that they did not have a very interesting relationship with Australia. We have already referred to the imports which China has restricted from pork to barley to wine. But we forget that the Australians export 80% of their iron ore to China, and China is dependent for its domestic requirements on 60%, to the extent of 60% of the Australian iron ore. So although they have symbolically punished Australia for having raised questions about coronavirus outbreak, reporting to WHO, asking for an inquiry, they have not touched the iron ore, because the Chinese economic recovery, COVID aftermath, depends on this import. So Australia probably knows that although it is dependent on the exports to China of its animal carcasses, animal feed, wine, barley, etc., far more important is the iron ore. So the Chinese-Australian relationship, despite almost on the verge of a trade war, would probably remain stable. Now, obviously, South Korea is not in a position to take pressure from China. New Zealand is much too minor a partner in this. But Japan doesn't want to put all its eggs in one basket. It still is trying to get India into this forum, and let's see what India does about this. So this is one part, the economic relationship. Chinese have an extremely interesting argument about this forum. They say that the Americans were trying to take decisions unilaterally. What they are trying to do is to set up a forum which is a multilateral forum. So it is not so important economically as it is important probably strategically and diplomatically to have another forum to negotiate, to have disputes settled amicably and get to know each other better. Now, this argument, of course, makes great sense to the countries in ASEAN region. It makes sense to Australia, New Zealand, etc. But it also makes us ask questions about the complacency of the Indians. The Indians believe that they don't have to worry about this new forum of regional comprehensive economic partnership arrangement because they already have free trade agreements with most countries in ASEAN region. But the point is that if China is going to be numero uno in this region, does that leave any space for India? Now, if you look at it, the countries in immediate neighborhood, Myanmar is part of SAARC, Myanmar is part of also ASEAN. But then if you look at the SAARC, the immediate South Asian neighborhood, India has absolutely hostile relationships with Pakistan, always deteriorating, and in recent past, the relationship with Nepal and Sri Lanka has not been the best. And the Chinese have also cultivated the Sri Lankans in the South Asian region. They are in a position to put pressure on Myanmar. So Indians should not be very complacent about what is happening in the immediate neighborhood, and perhaps keeping in mind that if Biden assumes presidency and revives the Trans-Indo-Pacific region economic cooperation trade area, things might be different. But till that time, this forum should not be entirely overlooked or neglected. After many failed attempts at bringing about a ceasefire, ultimately peace returned, one knows not for how long, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in the battle between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But the outcome was a bit of an anticlimax. Armenians were banking on the Russian support with whom they had a military alliance, but ultimately, there is no other word to put it bluntly, Putin let Armenia down. He prioritized Azerbaijan, although the Russians sent their troops to supervise the ceasefire and to separate the two warring factions, and apparently are in a position to enforce the truce or the ceasefire as well. But the net result was that the Armenians had to accept defeat. The Prime Minister is under great pressure to resign in Armenia. The foreign minister has resigned. They have had to cede territory which they had won almost 3 decades back. And for a whole generation, the Armenians who had been staying in Nagorno-Karabakh area have had to vacate their houses. And it's a very pathetic sight. Tens of thousands of refugees are heading back towards Armenia because they don't feel safe. They think there will be a pogrom, there will be a genocide after the Azerbaijanis come. And what is happening is something really, really very tragic. They are setting fire to their houses, so because they don't want to leave their houses to be used, violated. They think it's going to be a great violation by the Azerbaijanis. The Azerbaijanis have already given an assurance that they will not desecrate the churches, the places of worship, but it's difficult to imagine that because the way the Azerbaijanis have behaved under the support, provocation, prompting of the Turks, they have emphasized at each step their Islamic identity, the jihadi nature of their war, and they have targeted places of worship, civilian targets in the Nagorno-Karabakh area. So unfortunately, people who have stayed there, people who have been born and grown up as adults are leaving their houses. What is most tragic is that a whole generation who was born and grown up to adulthood in Nagorno-Karabakh is having had to leave and become refugees. They don't even know what their status would be once they reach Armenia. How long would they be treated as welcome refugees, brethren returning from an area, because they had taken it for granted that they are going to settle there. And the Azerbaijanis have always fought this war as a jihad, underlining their Islamic identity, supported very well by the Turkish arms. So I think this war is going to leave behind festering sores which will continue. Maybe the ceasefire will continue. Maybe the refugees will learn to live with their deprivation. But in a situation like this, there always is resentment, there always is a chance of violence flaring up, partisans taking up arms against that, and the sense of humiliation. The Armenians are refusing to accept how their government was fighting so confidently, why so many thousands of soldiers lost their lives when they could not even have an honorable ceasefire or a peace. So this humiliation, the national humiliation of Armenia, is going to disturb the Armenians for a long time, and the Russians might get away with their support of Azerbaijanis, but Armenians say that the greater oil wealth of Azerbaijan tempted Putin to resist coming to the aid of Armenians. Now this also doesn't do very well for Putin's image, because it has let down an ally with whom they had a treaty of alliance and security. Turkey has not been penalized. This takes us to another interesting question. What will happen to Turkey? Turkey is behaving like a rogue country from Libya to Eastern Mediterranean to Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a victory which allows Erdogan, who's at the moment surrounded by all kinds of challenges in his own country, economic, coronavirus, codes, etc., to say that, look, I have delivered a victory. I have delivered a victory. I have brought an Islamic nation, restored the pride of that country, and he's proved himself to be militarily capable. Now, European Union failed to or refused to either penalize Turkey, expel it from NATO, or even impose sanctions on it. Now, what is happening in European Union at the moment is pretty unsettling. Countries like Hungary and Poland have issued an ultimatum that they will veto the EU budget, because the EU budget, which provides economic assistance to the economies of poorer nations, Corona struck the member states, they said, why should we do that? And because they have also tied this aid to a condition. France and Germany have made it very clear that countries who do not believe in the rule of law, the countries who do not permit freedom of expression, where judiciary is not free, will not get this aid. Now, this is taken as an intrusion in the sovereignty of a member state by Hungary and Poland. They joined the European Union at a stage. They were allowed to become members when the European Union thought that it was expanding its base. They accepted, or at least their position was ambiguous till they became members. But once they are members, they have rights like any other member, the state of the EU, to veto the budget. If they veto the budget, it's going to be a major crisis for EU, and EU would not be in a position to penalize a NATO member like Turkey. Turkey is not a member of EU, but Turkey at one stage was keen to become a member of EU. Now, of course, it doesn't care one bit about it, but Poland and Hungary are in a position to create yet another crisis in the Brexit-ridden EU. And Brexit doesn't seem to end at all. Boris Johnson has once again had to quarantine himself after an exposure to his colleagues who were COVID positive. But the interesting part is that the person who had been his Rasputin, described as his Rasputin, Dominic Cummings, has had a fallout with his boss. He was made to go out. He said he would make himself largely redundant by the end of the year. But as things turned out, Boris asked him to stay not one day more. We don't have the time or the inclination to go into what led to that, but he is the man who was engineering vote no for membership of the European Union. He was the engineer of the Brexit. He was the engineer of the Boris Johnson's electoral victory. And now Boris Johnson is totally rudderless. So what is going to happen? And the time bomb is ticking. We are very close to no deal Brexit. And not only this, the United Kingdom has problems about Brexit with Ireland, with Wales, with Scotland, and all of them are very unhappy the way Cummings and Boris Johnson handled this. So this is going to be difficult to handle. Nagorno-Karabakh remains a festering source. Turkey remains an expansionist, fanatical Islamic power which is going to be a destabilizing factor. And European Union has another problem where the President Macron of France comes out with a hard-hitting statement about Islam needing in crisis, Islam needing reform. He is immediately branded as an Islamophobe, and he feels strongly about, he has an election coming up in less than 2 years' time, so he wants to emphasize on secularism, he wants to emphasize on core values of the French Republic, equality and rule of law and so on. And this is going to be a problem with European Union, some member states who have a different view on this, or this might be a far-right reaction against this also. So the far-right reacting adversely to tolerance towards Islamic extremist elements is going to be something which Europe will have to cope with. The continent of Africa was also full of misery as usual. Its cup was running over. But an unexpected crisis emerged in two totally different parts of Africa. One was Ethiopia, where the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy launched a military attack on Tigray, the rebel northern province. Now everybody had been calculating that the Tigrayans had been very unhappy about their being marginalized in politics of Ethiopia, they are being victimized, etc. And also the centralization of power by Abiy Ahmed in his hands in a federal structure of Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a federation of different tribal provinces. So it has implications not only of Tigray but for others. But even more dangerous is now once Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed decided that he would launch a full-blooded frontal military attack against Tigray to discipline them, it is a danger of spilling over of a civil war in all the neighboring territories. The Tigrayans have had a problem with Eritreans. The Eritreans were brought to heel, and the truce or the peace which got the Nobel Peace Prize to Abiy Ahmed was practically the civil war was won, brought to a conclusion by the Tigrayan armed forces. Now the Tigrayans also have a very large store of arms and armaments. They are fighting fit soldiers. They formed the cutting arm, the sword arm of the Ethiopian army. So although the Ethiopian army is pretty strong, it is pretty numerous, 140,000 people, but when they come to fight each other, it is likely to create havoc in the whole area. Already large number of refugees have moved over from Tigray to neighboring countries like Sudan and so on. So this displacement of Tigrayans is one thing, and also it might trigger resentment in other tribal provinces adjacent to southern Sudan, and this has potential of spilling over to Somalia, potential of spilling over to Sudan, and this is one part. And people were speculating that is Ethiopia going to collapse? Now Ethiopia has a distinction of being a country which was never colonized by a European power. It was only occupied for a short while during the Second World War by the Italians, but it had a 1,000 years old empire which ended with Haile Selassie when the Marxists took over from him in a coup. And this coup was ended by a coalition of tribal parties to which the Tigrayans and Abiy Ahmed belongs. They are all parties. Now, the Tigrayans had played a dominant role in Ethiopian politics ever since for past 3 decades. So their resentment is understandable. But also the way the power has been centralized in the hands of one person, one party, in a federal polity of tribal diversity is not going to succeed for long. Please remember that we have discussed before that Ethiopians had very ambitious plans to have a grand Renaissance dam, which had brought them into some kind of a conflict about the distribution of Nile waters with Egypt. Sudan was in the side sweep. But the problem is all this seems to be in jeopardy at the moment. And if Ethiopia implodes, crumbles in itself, it is likely to have far-reaching implications for the northeastern tip of the African continent. People have been saying that this will be like the northwestern tip, where in Libya, an ongoing conflict ever since Gaddafi was ousted has led to a very odd situation where Turkey is there, France is there, Egypt is there, and outside influences are there. As if this was not enough, a long established truce or ceasefire was also broken in Morocco and South Sahara. Now, South Sahara is a province which is separated from Morocco by a very thin strip of territory of Mauritania, and a very thin strip of road connects it with the port and the rest of Africa. Now, Polisario is recognized by the United Nations. They have been asking for an independence, and their autonomy has been, their right to self-determination has been accepted in a lot of resolutions in the United Nations. But the Moroccans believe that they are being used by external powers to destabilize Morocco, and of course Morocco claims a large part of the desert, which is a part of South Sahara. Now the interesting part is this, that under the desert there might be wealth like oil, like natural gas, and what is even more interesting is if the desert has a coastline, you also can have control of the exclusive economic zone and the seabed resources. So it is not as if you are fighting over arid wasteland, desert, etc. Now Morocco has accepted that it has tried to clear the passage to have its transportation, Morocco's communications with the rest of the Africa and access to the port. But the Polisario, the Marxist inclined leftist insurgent group, which claims a separate statehood for South Sahara, insists that this is an aggression which should be treated like an aggression. So unfortunately in Africa, in the eastern tip, northeastern tip and northwestern tip, we are going to have long periods of lack of peace, instability, etc. We have been so far discussing the anarchy spread by Islamic jihadi groups, splinter groups of Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab or Islamic Caliphate. But these are two issues separated from those. Now, if we move towards the eastern coast of Africa and the southern part of Africa, again, things were not very happy. In Mozambique, there have been beheadings in a football field of dozens of people by people who want to terrorize people. Of course, there was a complicity of Islamic groups there, but there again it is not so much Islam as it is the gas resources which Mozambique seems to cover. You have the problem in several places where elections have been held. Long ruling presidents continue to have rules flexed in their favor elastically and sort of expanded and continue to rule. There is resentment in people, there is large-scale corruption, and South Africa was yet another case where a billionaire pastor suddenly disappeared from South Africa and took refuge in a neighboring country, saying that he was accused falsely, he was being politically victimized because of his proximity of the notorious Indian businessman Guptas and former President Zuma. But all this continues to create a cauldron in Africa, whether it is South Africa, which was supposed to be progressive at one stage, modern at one stage, affluent at one stage. The law and order is very bad. And what we see is unfortunately no stability returning anywhere whatsoever. And again, this is an issue when Americans busy with their elections, Europeans busy with their problems with European Union, have not had time enough to have a long-term strategy for Africa, whether it is Nigeria, whether it is South Africa, whether it is Mozambique, whether it is Zimbabwe, whether it is Ethiopia, whether it is Morocco, you have the French Foreign Legion, you have the UN peacekeeping forces, but their hands are full and nobody has a long-term perspective on what they can do to stabilize Africa. They treat it only as a resource-rich territory where the multinationals can make their profits. Is a high-risk place, but the gains are also very high. So that's what we have to live with. And Indians who have an interest in Africa, again, not in a position, they watch as China seems to extend its roles in Africa. Another most interesting development in the past week was related to the development of COVID vaccines. And it's an extremely interesting case of how the discovery of a vaccine and its distribution across the world becomes a major strategic issue in international relations and international politics. There are about 12 what they call candidate vaccines at various stages of progress, and two of them announced. Moderna vaccine, an American vaccine, claims a success rate of almost between 92 to 94.5%. Another American vaccine by the pharma company Pfizer claims the success rate of 92%, and they think that they are in a position to bring millions of doses of their vaccines before the end of the year. Now, there have been two other vaccines before this which have been used as diplomatic tools. The Russians had two vaccines in developing stage. The first was Sputnik. They were the first to decide that they would use them. They would not wait for anything. Putin allowed one of his daughters to take a vaccine, and this vaccine is ready. And the Chinese also were developing more than one vaccine, but they said that one of their vaccines was in advanced stage, had finished the third phase of clinical trials, and they promised that their vaccine would be available to all the poorer countries who could not afford the vaccine. So they would say that forget about the success rate, forget about the safety and security, the affordability was the major issue, and vaccine, even if partial, would break the circuit of contagion. And they offered it to Nepal, they offered it to Sri Lanka, they offered it to Southeast Asian countries, they offered it to Philippines, they offered it to countries in Africa, they offered it to countries in Latin America. And for a short while, Bolsonaro stopped the trial after some mishaps took place in the Chinese vaccine trials, but they have been resumed. So there is a Chinese vaccine, there is a Russian vaccine, there are two American vaccines on the verge of success, and Indians have been also working on an Oxford vaccine, the Serum Institute of India, which has also almost completed the third phase of the clinical trials. Now, these are issues which relate to development of vaccine science. Now, where does the international relations and politics come here? There have been accusations that countries like Russia and China have been mounting cyber attacks on the labs where this research was on to steal the intellectual property or the secrets of the vaccines and use it in their own vaccines. Now, the other part is that where the vaccine is being weaponized as a diplomatic tool is this, that the question is very clear that these vaccines are not going to be cheap. They are going to be very, very expensive. So even if you take a vaccine like Moderna vaccine or a Pfizer vaccine between 92 to 95% success rate, there are other issues. Is the vaccine safe? Is the vaccine effective? And then efficacy has been proved. But how expensive is it? And how many people can afford it? And how is it going to be distributed? And even if you produce millions of doses, the population of the world is not in millions, but in billions, much beyond 7 billion. So how do you ensure that everybody gets a vaccine who needs it? Now, the interesting part about the Pfizer vaccine is that it is effective, but it requires storage at minus 80 degrees centigrade for a certain period of time before it can be stored in a refrigerator for a couple of weeks. So how many countries in the world would have the logistics to first of all freeze the vaccine to minus 80 degrees C, then also have the cold chain during the period of transportation and inoculation in refrigerators? Then again there is a problem is that most vaccines require 2 inoculations spread with an interval of about 3 weeks between the two of them. So again, the affordability and the logistics become very, very important. This is where the Moderna vaccine scores. The Moderna vaccine doesn't require this kind of a cold chain, but it still is expensive. Now, the third element which comes into the international politics is the countries which are rich, the countries which have funded this research have also got the first option to get 10 million doses. Now, even if the Americans get 10 million doses and each American who needs a priority of the inoculation has 2 doses, it doesn't cover the whole of the American population. So there has to be a decision that who's going to get the priority over the inoculation. One question: which country gets the monopoly or the first choice of getting millions of doses produced in its own country? You also have another vaccine which is being developed in cooperation with WHO called the COVAX. But the point is that none of them can produce vaccines in billions of doses in a time span and ensure that logistically they are delivered. So there is going to be a discrimination, like the digital divide, like everything else. The more powerful country, the richer country, and a smaller population would be in a position to effectively inoculate at least the frontline workers, the health workers, and then of course the old, the aged, the infirm, and that the young would not do that. Now again, the problem is that the international relations has suffered a great shock because of the COVID, not the least because of Trump's Luddite views. Trump first of all said that I don't need the vaccine, I don't believe in the vaccine science, it is something like a flu, it is the Kung Fu flu. Following him, Bolsonaro did the same thing, and both of them were stricken by the COVID. But they survived, they came out, so did Boris Johnson. But the problem is the damage has been done. Most people think that A, the vaccine is not going to be effective. Some of them also doubt that they have not been tested enough. For electoral reasons, they have been fast-tracked, they have been not tested enough, not rigorously enough. And you can't compare the plus minuses of the Chinese vaccine, the Russian vaccine, the COVAX vaccine. And Indians also have the option of having the Serum Institute of India producing vaccines. Millions of doses would be made available to India. But the Indian population is 1.35 billion. So again, it is going to be the problem of logistics, about cold chains, about who decides that who gets the shots first and who sort of. Now, it's interesting, during the Bihar elections, the statement was made that when the vaccine comes, Bihar would have the priority, they will get the vaccine. Now, that is an election promise. Elections will keep continuing in different states. So these priorities will also keep changing. But the problem in relations remains that there has been wonderful cooperation between pharmaceutical companies, between research labs in the universities, private institutions, and also they have pooled funds and resources. But by necessity, because they have to cope with the pandemic, they have to develop a vaccine on war footing. Maybe some corners have been cut. Maybe it is not entirely as safe as the normal protocol demands. Maybe the efficacy will be proved over a period of time, but maybe it will give the world a chance to develop herd immunity and recover. But in between, there will be intense diplomacy at the multilateral level, at the bilateral level, to receive X amount of doses, X doses of the vaccine from whichever source you get it, and you will say that we can use it for our people. So this is what is going to be fascinating to watch, is a life and death issue. And we have seen some of this at the time when the vaccine was being developed for HIV/AIDS, but that played out over a number of years. This is a pressure cooker situation where everything is taking place in less than a year. Most of the international diplomacy these days takes place through a digital medium, in virtual space, in cyberspace, and so it was with India's participation in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was virtually, and also this was followed by a BRICS interaction like this, and in coming weeks, India is also do the same with the G20 meetings. Now, when one watches this, one is a little amazed and intrigued by India's diplomatic stance. What are we doing in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization when we are having a major conflict with China on our borders? We are reluctant to name China as an enemy. We are reluctant to name China as an adversary. But the fact remains that China and India cannot be doing purposeful dialogue when there is no de-escalation on the border. Now, of course, Putin made it very clear that no bilateral issues would be allowed to be brought to this forum, but Indians would talk in general terms of terrorism, general talks of disarmament, nuclear disarmament, general terms of expansionism, in general terms of countries not intruding in each other's affairs, in general terms, very, very vague terms about countries should respect sovereignty of other nations and should respect the rules of international law. Now, all these apply to China, who has flouted all these things. Then why do we end up we say that fine, we keep the dialogue going, we meet each other at different places, but to our mind it signals wrong things to China, that India still wants to engage, not confront, not push back effectively enough. Now, India's temptation to continue with this interaction is that there is very soon it will be India's turn to be the chairperson of the BRICS. So maybe then India can take a greater initiative, push the agenda a little further to its own advantage. But whether it is G20, whether it is BRICS, whether it is SCO, let us face facts. Trump has done enough damage to multilateral forums, and unilateral bilateral diplomacy has always taken precedence over the past 3-4 years. Even if you take the Russians themselves, they have not treated the multilateral forums as their primary forums of diplomatic interaction. They have been doing unilaterally either military intervention or covert operations or cyber attacks and getting dividends for that. China doesn't even believe. China talks of multilateral interactions, has a facade of taking everybody, all the participants with it, but it is the dominant partner, and there is no question about anybody challenging what the Chinese are saying or flouting its wishes. So the problem with India continues, that India has also to live with a very hostile neighbor on its borders, Pakistan. Pakistan has not given up hope that even after Biden becomes the president, it probably will look more favorably towards Pakistan, look at its case in Kashmir a little better, because Democratic Party has always criticized India for human rights violations, for its treatments of minorities, but this is no guarantee that the Americans would sacrifice as important a strategic partner as India, especially in the context of China, and side with the Pakistanis. Indians obviously would be very naive to believe that the Americans would side with India on Kashmir or come out openly in its support. They have cultivated Pakistan as a strategic ally for the past 6.5 decades throughout the Cold War, and Pakistan remains important for them even today strategically in the context of Middle East, in the context of Central Asia, in the context of Afghanistan. And this brings us to the end of this week's review of international affairs. We hope that you found this useful. This is an interesting set of developments which took place. There was a ceasefire in Nagorno-Karabakh. There were signs of a civil war spilling across the borders in Ethiopia, and also unrest in Morocco and Southern Sahara. The problems with Turkey continued. Nobody was willing to build the cat, so to speak. And we have these residual problems of European Union and Brexit, which are likely to remain with us for the coming weeks, coming months. Time bomb is ticking, as they say. On 31st of December, Brexit, no deal Brexit will be a fait accompli. And that would leave United Kingdom in a very difficult position, where it has dissidents in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Also unhappiness in European Union, where they are finding the challenge from Hungary and Poland yet another thorn in their flesh, when they are already beset with the Brexit difficulties. Maybe after Trump concedes defeat and Biden takes over the keys of the new administration, maybe there will be a relook at Africa, there will be a relook at Europe, there will be a relook at Central Asia, there will be a relook in Southeast Asia. But till then, we have to wait and watch and worry about India, India's friends and India's enemies. Look forward to seeing you next week. Till then, goodbye.